Times were tough in the 1980s. The economy was struggling, jobs were uncertain, and families all across America were forced to make every dollar stretch just a little further. But through all of it, the kitchen became a place of resilience. Moms, dads, and grandparents dug into old traditions, improvised with whatever was on hand, and served up meals that were cheap, yet unforgettable. Tonight, we're taking a trip back in time to the recession years of the 1980s, when survival often depended on creativity at the dinner table. From government cheese sandwiches to Jell-O desserts, these are the 20 cheap meals families survived on during the 1980s recession. Each one tells a story, not just about food, but about grit, family, and finding joy in the simplest things. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't optional. Government cheese became a symbol of survival for families during the 1980s recession. Distributed through federal assistance programs, massive blocks of processed cheese landed in homes across America. It wasn't store-bought luxury, it was what the government had in surplus, and families learned to make the most of it. Grilled, melted, or eaten cold, this cheese turned into sandwiches that stretched tight grocery budgets. For kids, it was just lunch. For parents, it was dignity on a plate during hard times. From cheese to noodles, the next budget meal came straight from a 25-cent package that fed millions, ramen. At just $0.25 a pack, ramen noodles became more than a snack. They were a lifeline for families scraping by during the 1980s recession. Imported from Japan in the 70s, ramen exploded in popularity by the 80s. With families facing layoffs, and sky-high interest rates, ramen offered something rare: hot food for pennies. It was quick, filling, and endlessly adaptable with a bit of leftover meat or frozen veggies. For kids, it tasted fun. For parents, it meant no one went hungry. Ramen symbolized resilience, proof that survival could come in the form of a steaming, salty bowl. But noodles weren't the only staple. Next came a can of tuna that stretched across casseroles and sandwiches alike. If there was one ingredient that defined budget cooking in the 1980s, it was the humble can of cream of mushroom soup. For families trying to stretch every dollar, that creamy gray mixture became the secret weapon in countless kitchens. From green bean casseroles to tuna bakes, the soup acted like glue, holding noodles, vegetables, and whatever leftover meat was on hand into one steaming dish. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and it turned scraps into something that felt like a proper dinner. What made it so important was its versatility. You could pour it over rice, stir it into potatoes, or use it as sauce for chicken. One can make an entire meal possible. And while kids sometimes groaned at mushroom night, parents knew it was survival food. Looking back, those casseroles remind us how creativity thrived in hard times. The canned soup wasn't just food, it was comfort, connection, and proof that even a single can could feed a family. For many kids in the 1980s, breakfast wasn't poured from a fresh gallon jug. Instead, it came from a box of powdered milk mixed with water, a substitute that never quite tasted the same. Powdered milk wasn't new, but during the recession it became a staple. Families could buy it cheap in bulk, and it lasted far longer than fresh milk. On a bowl of cornflakes, it looked normal enough, but the first sip told a different story. For parents, it meant savings. For children, it often meant watery cereal and a quiet longing for the creamy richness of the real thing. Yet, families endured because it was what they could afford. Looking back now, those bowls of cereal remind us of the resilience of households everywhere. Powdered milk might not have been loved, but it carried families through mornings when every penny mattered. On countless recession-era dinner tables, the sizzle of Spam meeting a hot skillet was a familiar sound. Fried up with potatoes, it became a meal that filled both stomachs and memories. Spam had been around since World War II, but in the 1980s, it found new purpose. Families could stretch one can across several plates, adding sliced potatoes for bulk and flavor. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Kids sometimes wrinkled their noses, yet many secretly loved those crispy golden edges and salty bites. It was a dinner that cost pennies but tasted far richer than it should have. Looking back, Spam and potatoes tell a story of survival, how families turned mystery meat into comfort food when choices were few. It was resilience served on a plate. In the 1980s recession, many mothers and grandmothers turned back to an old tradition, baking bread at home. The smell of fresh loaves rising in the oven filled houses with comfort when wallets couldn't. Flour, yeast, water, and patience were cheaper than store-bought bread, and homemade loaves stretched further. Kids came home to thick slices slathered in butter, sometimes the only meal before bedtime. It wasn't just food, it was routine, ritual, and reassurance. Kneading dough became a rhythm of survival, the soft thump echoing across kitchens that had little but made much. Looking back, a warm loaf of bread wasn't simply sustenance. It was a reminder that love, effort, and resilience could rise even in the hardest times. For many families in the 1980s recession, canned tuna was the cheapest protein around. Add a bag of noodles, a can of cream soup, and a sprinkle of breadcrumbs, and dinner was ready. The casserole was filling, affordable, and easy to stretch for big families. Moms could feed 4 kids and still have leftovers for the next night. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept everyone full. What made it memorable was the creativity. Some families added peas, some a little cheese, others just whatever was on hand. No 2 casseroles ever tasted quite the same. Today, people look back on tuna noodle casserole with mixed feelings. For some, it was comfort. For others, it was survival disguised as dinner. Either way, it was a dish that defined the times. Nothing said cheap and filling in the 1980s quite like that little blue box. Inside was a packet of neon orange powder that magically turned boiled noodles into a cheesy dinner. It wasn't gourmet, but it was fast, inexpensive, and kid-approved. For less than $1, families could serve a meal that felt special, especially when compared to endless stews or beans. Some families stretched it further by adding hot dogs, tuna, or even leftover vegetables. Others served it plain, just enjoying the comfort of something warm and familiar on the plate. Looking back, boxed mac and cheese wasn't just food, it was a small taste of joy during tough times. For many kids of the 80s, that bright orange bowl became one of the happiest memories at the dinner table. In the 1980s, hot dogs and baked beans were a lifesaver for families watching every penny. Both were cheap, easy to find, and, most importantly, kids loved them. A pack of Franks and a can of beans could stretch into a full dinner for under $2. This simple combo carried echoes of older traditions too. Beans had long been a working-class staple, while hot dogs brought a taste of ballparks and summer cookouts into the home. Together, they made something that felt more joyful than just survival food. Parents often jazzed it up, slicing hot dogs into the beans, adding ketchup, mustard, or even brown sugar for sweetness. No matter how it was served, it filled bellies and put smiles on tired faces after long days. Looking back, it wasn't fancy. But for many families, hot dogs and beans were proof that even in hard times, comfort could be found in the simplest meals. In recession-era kitchens, nothing went to waste, and that's where the leftover soup pot came in. Every scrap of food, from half an onion to yesterday's potatoes, went into the simmering pot on the stove. Add some broth or water, and a whole new meal was born. This tradition had roots in Depression-era cooking, but in the 1980s, it was revived out of necessity. Families stretched a single chicken carcass or a handful of vegetables into a hearty stew that lasted for days. For kids, the flavors changed each night depending on what was tossed in. It wasn't just about thrift, it carried a quiet sense of resilience. Parents turned scraps into nourishment, showing creativity in the face of struggle. The smell of soup filling a kitchen often brought comfort that went far beyond the meal itself. The leftover soup pot reminded families that no matter how lean the times, there was always a way to turn nothing into something. Sometimes the simplest meals carried the most comfort. In the 1980s recession, rice and gravy became a lifeline for countless families. A single scoop of rice, topped with homemade gravy, could transform into a filling dinner that stretched pennies further than anyone thought possible. This dish had deep Southern roots, where cooks learned long ago how to stretch a tiny piece of meat into flavor for an entire pot of gravy. During the recession, the same principle spread across the country. A pound of rice cost very little, and a rich gravy, whether made from drippings, broth, or even bouillon cubes, turned it into a satisfying plate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a dish that filled bellies and kept families going. For kids, it often tasted like a hug in a bowl, with the warmth of gravy softening the hardship outside. Even now, for many who lived through it, rice and gravy isn't just a cheap meal, it's a memory of survival. Sometimes dinner wasn't hot, and it wasn't fancy, but it was enough. For many families during the 1980s recession, peanut butter spread on crackers became a quick fix when money and time both ran short. Peanut butter had long been considered a thrifty source of protein, and paired with inexpensive saltines, it provided just enough to quiet hungry stomachs. After school, kids would line up at the kitchen counter, stacking crackers with peanut butter like mini sandwiches. Sometimes, it wasn't just a snack, it was dinner. Though simple, this meal carried a kind of resilience. Parents didn't hide the struggle, they made the best of what was on hand. For some, the salty crunch and sticky peanut butter are remembered with a smile today, not because it was a luxury, but because it symbolized family pulling through hard times together. It was survival served on a small square cracker. In the kitchens of the 1980s recession, few dishes stretched $1 quite like cabbage and potato stew. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, filling, and cheap, three things struggling families needed most. Cabbage had always been a thrifty staple, going back to Depression-era cooking, and when paired with hearty potatoes, it created a meal that could feed a whole family for just pennies. A pot of this stew simmered slowly, its simple ingredients transforming into something that felt far more comforting than the sum of its parts. For many families, the smell of cabbage filling a small kitchen was both humbling and reassuring. Parents knew it wasn't steak or roast chicken, but it was nourishment, and it meant no one went to bed hungry. Today, some remember it with nostalgia, recalling bowls of steaming stew served with bread to soak up the broth. In the hardest years, cabbage and potatoes were proof that even the most modest meals could keep families going. In the 1980s recession, the humble bologna sandwich was king of the lunchbox. Cheap, salty, and endlessly available, it became a familiar sight at school cafeterias and factory breakrooms alike. Bologna itself was a descendant of old-world sausages, but in America, it was industrially produced, processed, and, most importantly, affordable. Families could buy a whole pack for a fraction of the price of ham or turkey. Paired with slices of white bread and maybe a dab of mustard, it became a quick, filling meal. Kids didn't always love it, but parents knew it kept bellies full without draining the grocery budget. Some households even fried the bologna, curling the edges in a skillet for a fancier touch. Looking back, many remember the squeak of bologna against teeth, the crinkle of wax paper wrapping, and the unmistakable smell that filled a lunchroom. It wasn't glamorous, but during tough times, bologna sandwiches represented survival, thrift, and a simple kind of comfort. If you grew up in the 1980s recession, chances are your morning didn't start with Tony the Tiger or Toucan Sam. It started with a plain white bag of cornflakes or crispy rice. During those years, flashy name-brand cereals were a luxury many families couldn't justify. Instead, generic store-brand versions filled the shelves, no mascots, no puzzles on the box, and certainly no prizes inside. Just simple packaging with bold black lettering that screamed, plain. For kids, it was often a disappointment, especially when friends bragged about marshmallow-filled cereals. But for parents, these no-frills options meant breakfast was still possible without breaking the bank. Families stretched powdered milk over them, added a spoonful of sugar, or simply ate them as they were. Looking back, those generic cereals became a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. They weren't exciting, but they kept families going when every penny mattered. In the 1980s recession, chili became more than just a hearty dish, it was a survival strategy. Families discovered that a single pound of ground beef could be stretched for days if you added enough beans. Cans of kidney beans, pinto beans, and even leftover vegetables found their way into big simmering pots. Meat became the accent rather than the centerpiece, a flavoring instead of the bulk. For struggling households, chili meant you could feed a family of 5 for just a few dollars. Kids sometimes complained, wishing for more meat and less bean, but the truth was, this bean-heavy chili kept everyone full. Many parents spiced it up with chili powder, garlic, or onions to disguise the frugality. Looking back, this dish represents the cleverness of recession kitchens. Meals that filled stomachs, saved money, and carried with them the flavor of endurance. During the 1980s recession, eggs were the backbone of countless American meals. Cheap, versatile, and protein-packed, they appeared at breakfast, lunch, and dinner alike. Scrambled eggs stretched across toast, hard-boiled eggs filled lunchboxes, and fried eggs topped plates of rice or potatoes. Families found dozens of ways to transform a dozen eggs into affordable meals. For parents, eggs were a godsend, one of the few items that could still be bought in bulk without breaking the budget. While kids might groan about eggs again, the truth was that they kept households fed when money ran thin. In hindsight, eggs became more than food, they were a quiet symbol of endurance. The sight of a frying pan sizzling with eggs takes many back to those lean but determined years, when survival meant making the simplest ingredients work. For families in the 1980s recession, pizza night didn't come from delivery boxes. Instead, it was born out of thrift and creativity, using plain white bread as the crust. Moms would spread tomato paste or ketchup across slices, sprinkle a bit of shredded cheese, and bake them in the oven. If there were leftover vegetables or pepperoni, they became toppings. Simple, quick, and cheap. For kids, this was magic. A slice of bread suddenly felt like restaurant food, and the smell of melted cheese filled kitchens with excitement. Even if it wasn't Domino's or Pizza Hut, it brought the same joy. Looking back, this homemade version wasn't just about saving money, it was about turning scarcity into tradition. Families laughed, shared, and enjoyed their own version of pizza night, proving that even in hard times, little moments of comfort could be created from the simplest ingredients. During the 1980s recession, families often turned to old immigrant recipes that had survived harder times before. One of the most beloved was cabbage rolls stuffed with rice. Cabbage was cheap, filling, and easy to grow in backyard gardens. A single head could be boiled, softened, and wrapped around rice mixed with a touch of ground beef or seasoning. Baked in tomato sauce, the dish fed an entire family at a fraction of the cost of eating out. For many children, the flavor was unforgettable, savory, tangy, and comforting. For parents, it was a way to keep family heritage alive while staying within a strict budget. These rolls reminded many of their grandparents' kitchens, echoing back to Depression-era frugality and immigrant resilience. What made cabbage rolls special wasn't just the taste, but the love and patience poured into rolling each leaf. Even in tough times, meals like this carried history, heart, and the strength of family tradition. As the 1980s recession dragged on, families still craved a little sweetness at the end of the day. That's where Jell-O came in. Bright, colorful, and cheap, it was the dessert that lifted spirits without draining wallets. A single box cost pennies and could stretch into a treat for an entire family. Mothers layered it with whipped topping, added canned fruit, or molded it into wobbly shapes that became the centerpiece of Sunday dinners. Kids loved the jiggle, while parents loved that it made something cheerful out of almost nothing. But Jell-O wasn't just dessert, it was escape. For a few moments, that shimmering bowl offered relief from the stress of layoffs, rising prices, and hard choices at the grocery store. The vibrant reds, greens, and oranges stood in stark contrast to the gray financial mood of the times. It was a reminder that even in hard times, families found ways to celebrate. Simple, sweet, and unforgettable, Jell-O became a symbol of childhood comfort during the toughest decade. Looking back, these meals remind us that food is more than just fuel. It's memory, tradition, and the comfort of knowing that even in the hardest times, families found ways to come together. The 1980s recession tested households across America, but out of that struggle came recipes, laughter, and lessons that still resonate today. Which of these meals do you remember from your childhood? Or maybe you still cook some of them today. Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories of the chain of facts. Because sometimes, the simplest meals are the ones we never forget.